So this is Lewis, and this is just going to be a quick thank you to the $25 level or above supporters that I have on Patreon. I'd like to thank Winnie C, Jeremy S, and especially Anonymous, who made up for several people dropping off during the month. He effectively doubled his donation, which I will thank him for. So again, I'd like to thank you guys, Jeremy, Winnie, and Anonymous, who I wish you'd let me name you, but you're apparently some sort of super special insider. You're so above me, so I can't even say your fucking name, brother. But yeah, thank you guys for your support, and we will go right into the video, and make sure you watch till the end, because I will thank those of you that are donating in terms of the $15 amount at the end. So this is Lewis, and for today we have this video by Vice exploring why so many white men have a particular captivation with East Asia. If we're being honest, this is pretty much what you'd expect from a regressive outlet like Vice. It's a pack of race-obsessed Bay Area moralists unable to understand the interests of what they view as their antithesis despite being the mirror image of themselves. This is not about me or anyone in favor of race mixing. This is actually about the Bay Area moralists trying to square up to the alt-right. Neither faction is equipped to take each other on or remove the other because both agree on too much, but for completely different reasons, or seemingly different reasons. Neither group believes in the ideals that fit within the boundaries of the U.S. Constitution and in many ways seek to destroy our liberal, egalitarian, capitalistic, and free society. Before we really get into this, however, I want to talk about what is now being called the alt-left, but is really still the Bay Area moral majority. It is a coalition of leftists that don't give a single shit about class, labor, economics, or representing the values of the traditional left, but instead talk about collectivist bullshit that doesn't do anything to challenge the status quo. The reason why is that their financial backing does not come from East Coast labor, but instead West Coast white-collar cocksuckers. I never got the chance to play this video featuring Tucker Carlson and Jason Whitlock, but understand that I'm not alone in recognizing this East Coast versus West Coast distinction. No one, including the leaders of national labor unions, is talking about East Coast labor anymore. Everyone is instead obsessed with every retarded, inapplicable, utopian whim coming out of Silicon Valley and especially Bay Area academia.
There's a new piece at The Atlantic. Frank Foer, the New Republic, wrote it. And he says that Silicon Valley has basically taken over journalism and is ruining it with a focus on sensationalist clickbait and maximizing traffic. ESPN seems to be doing its part because it's always fanning these feuds instead of covering sports. Do you think that's a fair critique? Do you think that Silicon Valley is affecting news coverage in a way that's bad?
No question, Tucker. You and I talked about this several months ago, and I was very thrilled to see The Atlantic write this piece because I want the left side of the media to talk about this. Look, the media used to be obsessed with New York and New York liberal values. I think everybody understood that. Now it's dominated by Silicon Valley, Northern California, and San Francisco values. And that is a completely different animal. That's a revolutionary animal. That's an animal that really doesn't believe in this country. And so when you look at Google, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, in order to really be popular and to be represented in those spaces, the Silicon Valley spaces, you have to be extreme left-wing. And they are trying to silence any of us that are moderate or to conservative, and those voices can't even be heard over these Silicon Valley social media machines that the rest of the media is addicted to. It's had an amazing influence on the media and the racial division that we're seeing in this country.
The voices of the 20th century left wing were predominantly situated on the East Coast, and while obviously imperfect in providing sufficient arguments to maintain ideological hegemony, it should be obvious at this point that flawed old world leftist politics are better than the contemporary utopian social constructivist illiberal collectivist dogma spewing out of the Bay Area. The American left wing needs to reform, but before that's even possible, we need to turn back to the ideological concept of representing workers instead of management in our free market. We need to be focusing on the economic and social interests of the working class and be willing to engage in arguments regarding a class dynamic. By conceding concepts like egalitarianism, protectionist economics, racial equality and opportunity, which is an argument favoring individualism and the interests of the working class, such as immigration related to labor, the American left wing is leaving the average American no alternative other than to look to the right for solutions. We can't even get to the debate of classical liberalism in the modern left if we disagree that white Americans and the working class deserve representation on any level. And never forget that you made this racial. The reason I even distinguish white Americans when I want to remove qualifiers such as African, Asian, Latino, or Native from just being American is because you made that distinction. As a nation, we have abandoned that difference. It is solely the Bay Area moral majority, aka the alt-left, that retains that separatist dogma on a mainstream level. This is besides the point now, but Vice had the opportunity to interview Jared Taylor, who is an outspoken white identitarian and key figure in the American white nationalist movement. Vice should already know what these people think and why, but the alt-left has no intellectuals guiding them, so they're completely incapable of comprehending these arguments. With all that out of the way, let's get to this dopey fucking video.
Our streets, whose streets, 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 our streets.
If you've seen footage from the Charlottesville protest, you might have noticed something a little strange. Chris Cantwell, who's a white supremacist, has an Asian tattoo. The tattoo's a little slappy, but it's supposed to be the Japanese character for truth. And it's actually not that strange. White supremacists love Asia, especially Japan. And every well-known white supremacist in recent memory seems to have some kind of weird Asia fetish.
I don't suppose you and your shitty throwback haircut is going to actually distinguish why that is. It's obvious why white nationalists look at an ethnically homogeneous nation as preferable to our own. What's amusing is that most white nationalists are wrong about Japan in terms of it being purely collectivist. Asia is far more collectivist than the West, but that's because Western intellectuals are radically individualistic. The founding fathers of the United States were radically individualistic. The Western Enlightenment thinkers were radically individualistic. Obviously not all were, but the ones that impacted the West the most were. The end result was the United States becoming the hegemon of the world. Not bad considering this part of the world focuses more on the individual and liberty over whatever backward shit you believe, Mr. High-Top Faggot. My point is that Japan is distinctly more individualistic than any other Asian nation. Pew Research has stated this in multiple studies. Japan is very liberal compared to the other Asian nations. If white nationalists weren't already a pack of retards, I'd recommend that they focus more on South Korea, because they actually are more focused on mundane differences and are hyper-collectivist. To my knowledge, South Korea has many draconian and illiberal policies, including an outright ban of pornography. Based on what I've read, South Korea is in favor of free markets, but still, if one is looking for a non-communist and yet stridently illiberal collectivist nation, South Korea is pretty bad.
Everyone from former KKK Grand Wizard David Duke, to far-right Norwegian extremist and mass murderer Anders Breivik, to Charleston shooter Dylan Roof, have all raved about the virtues of East Asian countries and praised Japan as a model to follow. So what gives? Why do racists like Japan so much? Well, the short answer is, they view Japan as a mono-ethnic utopia, which is exactly what they wish the US was.
Which makes little to no sense to me, as someone with at least a tacit understanding of Japanese culture. Japan is a hyper-consumerist nation plagued with problems. Half of the country is atheist or culturally Buddhist, and young people are having problems interacting with one another despite living in a country clearly more collectivist than the United States. If America's problem is godlessness and native people not fucking enough, why would you look to Japan as any kind of solution? Looking at Japan makes me want to buy a product from Jaleel. Link can be found in the description. Watch hentai or fuck someone outside of my race. Japanese culture is not a solution for white people in America. If you ask me, Japanese influence in America is actually making race mixing between whites and Asians far more palatable.
Here's how Richard Spencer puts it.
It's wonderful being in Japan. It is an ethno-state. Japan, whatever problems it might have, does not have the problem of diversity, and therefore Japan can truly be a homeland. It can be a home.
I'm pretty sure Richard Spencer is a retard, and seriously doubt someone like Jared Taylor would agree with him. Although I can't say for sure.
But it's a little more complicated than that. It's not just that white supremacists love Japan, it's that they have to love Japan. There's a precedent for this in Nazi Germany.
Oh my fucking god, can we just please acknowledge that this is about fucking collectivism and not just Adolf fucking Hitler?
By the early 1900s, Japan had become powerful enough to pose a military threat to some European countries, which in turn poses a threat to the idea that white people are inherently superior. So even though Adolf Hitler personally didn't like Japan very much, publicly, he had to say that he respected the Japanese.
Are we not going to mention the massive strategic incentive Germany had with aligning with Japan as it related to China or Russia? Or the fact that it already held immense power in the Pacific? Or just fucking forget it.
Fast forward to today. The economic success of some Asian countries poses an intellectual quandary for even the most sophisticated Reddit troll. Even things like college acceptance rates for Asian Americans kind of throws a wrench in the whole white superiority idea.
Bro, this is actually your contradiction to explain, because you likely believe the United States to be, quote-unquote, structurally white supremacist. Asians, on average, embarrass those in our society that are, on average, always demanding a handout. Asians never asked, never received, and do better, on average, than whites. The United States, in my opinion, gives preferential treatment to the rich, but does not discriminate based on race. Asians are, on average, more successful than whites because Asians are, on average, more productive than whites. Amazingly, by your own admission, the white supremacists acknowledge this. You don't. That says more about you than it does them.
So some modern white supremacists have gone even further than Hitler did, and don't just tolerate Asians, they actually idolize them.
Are you fucking telling me that white supremacists conceded racial superiority to Asians? Are you fucking kidding me, bro?
That's why white supremacist Jared Taylor told a Japanese news crew, in fluent Japanese because he grew up there, that blacks and Latinos are inherently inferior to whites. But he also said that Asians have higher IQs than white people. When he was asked for details, he just said, that's biology.
I'm not even sure that's true. I think Jews actually score higher in IQ than Asians or whites. Are white supremacists conceding the racial superiority of Jews next? I get the feeling that isn't the case.
Now, the quote-unquote science behind studies that support this sort of thing has been pretty roundly debunked.
No, to my knowledge, Charles Murray's research on race intelligence and predicting outcomes still stands. The separation between someone willing to accept the research and a race realist is what one expects to do with that information. I don't really think anything should change. According to research, there is a difference in intelligence between men and women. So what? It doesn't mean anything unless you're a collectivist that can't contain your authoritarian autism.
And there's no evidence that homogeneity equals success, whether that's in Japan or elsewhere. But white supremacists keep blindly worshiping Asians, because if they don't account for them somehow, then the whole ideology starts to fall apart.
They don't worship Asians. They envy their racial homonymy. They don't worship Asians. They envy their racial homonymy. They envy their racial homonymy. They envy their racial homonymy. Fuck you. Quit being hyperbolic.
It's also pretty convenient, and pointing to successful Asian people allows you to argue that racism doesn't exist.
Are you out of your fucking mind?
You believe that white people hold privilege in American society. How the fuck can you state the obvious that Asians on average do better in America than whites, which is the majority of the population? I know you believe in racial structures, institution, and white privilege because all progressives do, including Kyle Kulinski. So when I say all progressives, I mean it. So it is now on you to explain how in our white supremacist nation filled to the brim with Nazis in government, including our alt-right-in-chief Donald Trump, Asians are disproportionately successful. You explain that.
And pointing to successful Asian people allows you to argue that racism doesn't exist, and that any socioeconomic problems that blacks or Latinos face is because their culture or their DNA is inferior.
Listen here, you chia pet shithead. Racism does exist and will always exist. No matter how much you or I pressure society, we will always have racists. It seems to me that right now in America, we have a very real problem with black supremacists and anti-white bigotry. I would like to do a video covering it at some point because it does exist and no one gives a shit about it outside of the alt-right. The only way to combat white identity is to stop punishing white people for their skin color and focus on individualistic principles. Seeing all Americans as individuals equal in rights and opportunity is better than anything being offered by collectivists like you.
And pointing to successful Asian people allows you to argue that racism doesn't exist, and that any socioeconomic problems that blacks or Latinos face is because their culture or their DNA is inferior.
DNA, no. Culture, yes. I'm sorry, but culture and upbringing plays a serious role in why Asians are so successful on average in America, and why blacks on average are unsuccessful when given the same opportunity. I would agree that economics plays a role, and I would back changes to the status quo in that regard, but everyone should be treated the same. For every poor black kid growing up without a father, you have far more white kids growing up in the same circumstances. Yet if you look at poverty, crime, unemployment, and everything else, blacks make up a disproportionate percentage. That's on those people failing to take advantage of the opportunities offered to them. It may be hard work to elevate to the middle class, but I'm doing it. I'm working full-time, own tons of nice shit, and I'm in the market for a house. I don't even have a professional career, but if I marry a woman with a decent enough income, I'll actually elevate into the middle class. Why is it I can become middle class in a single generation with a bullshit degree and a bad job, yet millions of people can't? Circumstances, yes, bad things happen, but bad choices are far more likely. I'll reiterate that I am not satisfied with the current economy. I think globalization, neoliberalism, and trickle-down economics only helps the already rich at the direct expense of workers. But even with that as the status quo, success is possible.
But really, it all comes down to what people do when the way they look at the world is challenged. Some people take a step back and say, hey, maybe something else is going on here, like maybe racism or structural inequality.
It can't be you. It has to be some phantom force oppressing you. What about this is challenging? How is it appropriate for someone to just write everything wrong in their life off on an obvious scapegoat that they've never even had an anecdotal experience with? I'm a fucking loser. Must be the fault of a cop or bureaucrat I never met. What sense does that make?
And some people just get a Japanese tattoo.
Well, that was fucking stupid. You didn't offer anything contradicting or arguing against the white nationalists. All you did was call them fetishists and fail to address why Asians do better in a white supremacist nation than whites. This is why the left is losing, and why progressives will never create a better America. You're in favor of discrimination, despite knowing that Asians didn't require it in order to succeed. That's your intellectual bridge to gap and no one else's. For now, I'll propose giving job applications and free condoms to black men, because at least there, we eliminate two of the problems plaguing a disproportionate number of people. I can't force people to make smart choices, but I can at least offer them the opportunity. Thanks for listening. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It took me not that long to edit, actually. I cut a little bit of the fat off of it, but I do think that this turned out fairly well for a scripted video, and I will be posting that script on my Patreon. But for right now, I'd like to thank those of you that have supported me at the $15 level, which is Will M., who I recognize, Matt D., Luykus, and if we go all the way back to the beginning, I will thank once again Anonymous, Winnie C, and Jeremy S for continuing to support me on Patreon. If you'd like to, you can skim through the description of this video and take a look at some of the names. I don't really know if I want to bring too much attention to people's names, but you can go ahead and look through the description if you want to see the other people that actually help support this channel and have my eternal thanks. And so I'd like to thank all of you that support me on Patreon, and encourage anyone that would like to go onto my Patreon account, which you can find linked, and support me there, because it does provide a decent amount of incentive for me to try a bit hard, at least once a month, to do a video just like this. Alright? Thanks for listening.